freedom in philosophy is it's like really, really nebulous, and it's very ill-defined. Yet, in some sense, it's at the core of all philosophical ideas. Like, if you think back to Plato, like all philosophy is a kind of an expression of the idea of freedom. In some sense, all the different branches of philosophy connect to it. Like, you think of sort of the question of aesthetics, creativity of the artist. You think of politics, it's the question of the limitations of the state versus individual freedom or liberty, civil rights, things like that. If you think of epistemology, we have debates about the limits of causality and free will and determinism. But it's very, very hard to define. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, it is. It is hard to define on those terms, and I think a mistake that often gets made with that is to assume that the concept has been spoken about in the same way in different eras and in different contexts and things. For example, in Plato's time, although some people have argued against this, but I agree with Hannah Arendt when she says that the Greeks just didn't have a concept of the will yet. That comes in with Christianity. Arendt says it's in Paul, and certainly by Augustine it's them. So you have to, if you're looking at the ancient Greek use of the word, you have to think of it in terms of, or finding a way of thinking about it without thinking about the will, which is the central idea of freedom in the modern context, and obviously very important for scholasticism as well. So, and then even in like early modern to modern discussions of it, you've got this distinction between when we talk about freedom as a political concept and when we talk about it as a metaphysical concept, and these are all attached to different debates. So I think, yeah, it is nebulous, but you can kind of be helped by just reminding yourself of the history and the context that you're looking at for.
Yes,
That's interesting.
That's interesting. So the idea is that historically, our understanding of what it means to be free is, well, historically determined, and it changes given the different sets of priorities and obligations and normative commitments that people have at different points in history. So what is it looking like right now, Matt? What is history?
Well, so one of the things Heidegger says, as an aside, in one of his lectures, is that we experience freedom as the releasement from chains. So it's an experience we have through becoming free or realizing that we're not, in short. So what I find helpful is to think about what is it that the particular people talking about freedom see themselves as imprisoned by. It might not even be a type of imprisonment or limited. Libertarian will say it's the state is encroaching. So for them, freedom is all about autonomy and regulation and being left alone. Whereas for the ancient classical Athenians, freedom was about escaping the everyday boring bits of life and trying to achieve some sort of immortality by doing great deeds. So what was being escaped there was what they saw as a mere animal existence. So what you have to do is sort of like look at it. What do people feel is encroaching on them? I guess for today, I gave you one of those, which would be your libertarians see it as the state, as this power that's encroaching upon them and their ability to do whatever they want. Whereas for other people, it's going to be very different things. I know we kind of joked about this before we came on, but AI might be a threat to freedom. In that,
Go on, Matt.
I mean, I'm sure your listeners are sick of hearing about AI, but if you there's a message being said mainly by the people who want to make money out of this, which is that this is like a industrial revolution moment and everything has changed. A couple of weeks ago, there was a reports that in Microsoft, the employers aren't actually using it. And from the top, they've said, no, you will use it now. And managers have been told that they'll be judged on how much their employees are actually using it. And obviously there is a significant change here in how what work's going to be like, but it's sort of like you lose that kind of freedom to do your craft the way that you've been doing it before. There's a kind of a disruption there. And you're not entirely in control of where it's going. I mean, one of the things that Heidegger says about technology is we're not really able to stop it. and it's just always there. Every time there's a new development, it will drag us forward and push us into a new thing. So I think AI is a good example of the general point that Heidegger makes about how technology is not a tool. It's not something we can sort of pick up or put down. So it's not really. I've got a lot of sympathy with people who talk about the environmental impact of AI as being a reason not to use it, but you personally not using it is not going to stop it from continuing to disrupt our work lives and so forth.
Well, we should probably mention this so listeners know that a figure who's important for you in your understanding of freedom is Martin Heidegger, and your recent book is called Heidegger's Conception of Freedom Beyond Cause and Effect. Is that right? I got it right. Thank you. So Matt is showing it up for so listeners know we're listening on audio. Well, I suppose then we can ask what is it about Heidegger's specific concept of freedom, and that's different. Traditionally in philosophy, I've said it on the podcast before. There's like three very elementary philosophy 101 ways of understanding freedom. Something is freedom is either is if something is determined, it's not free, and if something is free, it's not determined. Although there's a bit of a paradox in that because freedom is a type of self-causing, unimpeded self-causing. So it's impossible to understand freedom without understanding causality. That's the traditional story philosophy tell you. But you, as the subtitle of your book suggests, says we need to think beyond cause and effect. And Heidegger is someone who looms large for you in that.
Yeah. So what's really distinctive about Heidegger's treatment of freedom is his total rejection of the standard free will debate that you get, that you were describing there, Patrick, where it's kind of ossified now into two questions. Do you think that causal determination actually exists? So do you believe that the universe is ordered according to something like cause and effect, and that every event must have a cause? And then the second question being, do you think that whatever freedom is, it's compatible with that? And so one of the problems with where the free will debates ended up today is that everything's kind of sewn up. There are only three possible positions, and all of the arguments is about how we nuance those positions and which ones are valid, which ones are invalid, and it just goes around in circles. But Heidegger argues that that entire way of looking at the question of human freedom is it's a false problem. So it's grounded on not just false assumptions about reality, but false questions, which is an interesting idea. So it's a question that is not going to actually give you anything that's meaningful. And the main issue, it takes him a while to argue it because it is quite a difficult point. But one of the ways that he sort of sums this up into something like a slogan is that freedom isn't a problem of causality. Causality is a problem of freedom. So,
ooh.
Yeah, I mean, which it's
that's very elliptical, Matt. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yoda.
Yeah, very Yoda. It's not super helpful. But what he means by that is, it's part of a methodological argument of which he's using freedom as an example, where he says that if you're going to do philosophy properly, you need to kind of understand what question you're asking, understood as this sort of like almost babushka doll of different problems contained within each other. So he says that the way that the modern, by modern I mean sort of early modern onwards, conception of freedom starts with, we've got this thing called causality, how do you fit freedom into that? And he argues that, well, causality is not a founding phenomenon. It's not something fundamental.
It can't be, can it? Because it can't really be, because every as we know, every cause has a preceding every effect has a preceding cause, rather, unless you want to go all the way back to the first cause and that kind of metaphysical idea. But I don't think that's what.
Yeah, I mean, those paradoxes are an indication that it's an interpretation rather than something like fundamental. I mean, he means it in a broader way than Hume, for example, who would say that causality is not something we have knowledge of; it's just a way that we think. But rather than actually advancing the way this argument works, he rather than sort of advancing, this is what I think causality is or freedom is, he sort of goes and starts nesting the question. So, what is causality an answer to? And he says it's an answer to the question of movement. Why do things move when they move? And that allows him to go to his favorite specialist subject, which is Aristotle. So, and he makes the claim that there has been no philosophy of movement since Aristotle. Everything just repeats that. Whether that's true or not is a separate question. I think Bergson probably does add something to it. But he says, okay, so what is movement? Movement is a way of trying to understand being as a beings or the nature of beings. And he looks at Aristotle's arguments about movement when he starts to develop his theory of how it happens. And it's all about what parts of a being change and what parts of a being don't change. So substance and accident, in short. And so he says, okay, so movement is an answer to the question of the nature of change within a being. So he says, well, what is being? Which is his favorite question. And he looks at the way the Greeks of the time would have understood the term that's being used there, ousia, and he argues that how they understood it is just presence or constant presence. It's actually, he claims that the word ousia actually comes from the word for property in the sense of houses. It's a sort of property that hangs around. Like, that's not actually going to disappear, but it's something that's a good investment. And from that, he says, okay, so something that's a being is something that is there all of the time as opposed to only there some of the time. And that's, again, mapped onto that idea of substance being what's essential to us and accident what's only a mode or a modification of it. So whether we're sitting down, standing up, and so forth. And then he says, well, constants, so it's just this sort of like hierarchy of problems. Constants and presence are concepts of time. And so what that means is that when we try and ask what is being, we get an answer in terms of time. And he says, well, why? And then that becomes his central problem of being in time, and why his main book is called Being in Time, is why do we understand being in terms of time and vice versa? And that's the thing that needs to be investigated. And then he'll start to build that back up again to bring in freedom, because if I could say it in a sentence, his answer is going to be that we are the beings who are responsible for how we interpret and act in the world. And that gives us a way of talking about being that comes in prior to all of the metaphysical baggage about causality and substance and so forth. So freedom's articulated as this more primordial concept or question that precludes all of that early modern metaphysics. And so he's able to say from that, this is how we should think about freedom. Let's not get bogged down in the causality stuff because it's so it's emergent from a set of decisions that he's not agreeing with, basically.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Matt. I think that the first thing that strikes me about the Aristotle connection is this idea of movement. If we try to understand freedom in an everyday sense, it kind of looks a bit like movement. And you can understand why Heidegger is interested in movement, because movement is that it kind of looks a bit like time, because it's it's dynamic. Something is not resting, but for it also to take place, there has to be some kind of sense of space as well, or something is moving in space. And you think of both of those things together. Now, that's ridiculously abstract way of putting it. Like, think about freedom, but if you think, like, Heidegger's very good at this, he's actually quite good at connecting abstract concepts to sort of everyday life. And in some sense, it matters to human beings that they are free to move about in space. That takes time, and that's what I think he's trying to make explicit about the nature of freedom, of what it actually is and why it's important.
Yes, Patrick. No, I think that's fair. I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, that I quite like that thing I just went through, because it's but you do kind of need to know a lot of philosophy to follow it, because that's basically a genealogy that he's giving for where this comes from. But what's crucial to all of Heidegger's work is that anything that we're talking about should be graspable in terms of our like normal everyday experience of it, because he's a phenomenologist. So anything that's too abstract is just something to be suspicious of. So how would that translate into everyday life? Well, certainly, what you're talking about, like life is movement in a sense, and the judgments we make about the changes and movements we make in the world um, are going to be based on our interpretations of what that means. So, um, to take examples, a lot of social commentary, and by that I mean like what's sort of in opinion sections of newspapers and on social media rather than academic, assumes a very sort of early modern Cartesian idea of cause and effect. So if someone is addicted to something, it is because they have chosen to start taking a particular substance and they're not choosing to stop it. The opposite of that position would be that they were determined to start, or now that they have started, they're no longer able to escape it. Everything in our, if we have an argument with people that we know, it'll always come down to, well, you did this, and then that happened, and that was your fault. So all moral discussions imply this sort of framing of how we look at what are just basically our movements around the world and doing things and picking up and give this particular narrative, which is that for everything that happens, it's someone's fault. And that is something that, I mean, he doesn't explicitly say, I want to get rid of moral philosophy, but this is a reason why we might be skeptical of certain forms of it. And certainly the account of human being he gives in Being and Time is not compatible with it, because you can't ever isolate a human being in a particular moment so it can be a cause or an effect within a causal chain, because the entire the assumption of this chain of cause and effect or causal determination is that everything is isolatable in a particular moment, and at each moment we can say it came from this past and is heading towards this future. And humans don't work like that. They are sort of spread out across time in a fundamentally ambiguous way.
So again, then that's why we get so het up over freedom. So it's something that's massively important, yet it's something that we can't actually define. Which goes back to what you're exactly saying, isn't it? It's not definitional, and there's political questions here, obviously, as well, in terms of the political understanding of freedom, which we can talk about. But just in the immediate experience of freedom, I think, which is what Heidegger's trying to do, freedom is open in some sense rather than closed or determined.
Yes. Yeah. And what it will come down to is something quite personal as well, because the the transformation that happens in Heidegger's arguments is always we take something metaphysical, which has always got this kind of God's eye view, independent, objective way of articulating the world, and then that gets transformed into not something subjective, but something that recognizes that everything in the world is something that happens to me and that I have to do something about it. So the concept of freedom that he comes up with, which is most famously articulated by the idea of being towards death or freedom towards death, is all about why you're doing something at a particular moment. Now, if you're doing it because this is you're just sort of conforming to society, then it's not going to count as freedom, although it would count as freedom if freedom is just not being caused. So that's a sign that cause and effect is useless in talking about this sort of thing. So if I'm doing it because I'm going to work and I'm doing this particular thing because I need to earn money, that's not an expression of freedom. Even though you're not causally determined to do it, you're just doing it. Whereas if you, I don't know, this is a very middle class example, but if you're like, oh, I'm going to go abroad for a year, I'm going to like quit my job, I'm going to use my savings, and I'm going to go abroad and do some traveling because I only live once and so forth. That might be freedom. And if you're doing that because you got the idea from a magazine and you're just like, oh, that sounds like an experience, then that's probably not freedom. So it's never something you can identify from the outside.
So
It's
it's not a thing. Freedom is
Yeah,
not a thing.
yeah,
It's not.
freedom's
Yeah.
not a thing. It's also not something you can necessarily identify in yourself. It's what he's trying to talk about is the difference between decisions that come out of well, decisions that we kind of fall into, or decisions or acts that we do that come out of a genuine sense of we are the only justification for our actions.
So some type of liberation or self-emancipation then.
Those are terms that is used with it. I don't find them so helpful because it's never permanent. So that he's not talking about self-actualization. You can't just, it's not that we're waiting for the one free act and then we're sort of born again into a new free way of life. It's something that some people might never do, some people might do a few times in their life. It's a rare moment, and although the language he used to describe it starts to sound like he's really keen on us doing it all the time, I just don't think he can mean that, because someone who constantly made decisions out of their freedom towards death would be so chaotic, because it's the ability to go, do you know what? All of the significant, I'm going to change what is significant to me in the world, and that isn't necessarily some of the it's not a moral imperative that he's saying, because some of the things that you can do on that justification can be quite bad. For example, having an affair can have tremendous impact on people, but that is something that you could do according to a freedom towards death, of saying, well, I'm going to choose that it's not significant to me, the impact of what I'm doing. I'm just going to choose this for me because I'm going to die at some point. So the thing that, going back to what I said at the beginning about how if you want to understand what freedom is, you have to ask what the person talking about freedom is saying is not freedom or is unfreedom. If we do that with Heidegger, it is universal meanings and conformism, really. It just ends up being really existentialist. It's God, effectively. So it's God or godlike beliefs that basically everything's taken care of. There is a human nature, whether it's defined according to humanistic lines or according to theological lines. There is a right or a wrong way of being a human being. For Heidegger, freedom is the recognition that there is no right or wrong way of being a human being. We are an abyss of meaning. The only things that are meaningful are those which we find meaningful, and there is no more fundamental ground underneath it. And he calls that an existential guilt, because we realize that there is nothing more fundamental than us responsible for why we chose this career or why we do this particular thing in our lives. It's just us, and there's nothing underneath us. And we are mortal. That's all there is in life. And if you choose to do something or make a decision in your life based on that recognition, it's freedom. If you base it on anything else, it's not freedom.
This then would suggest that freedom, in the sense that you're developing it through Heidegger, it's not about causality in some sense. It's not about choice, I think, would be another implication. Would that be right? Yeah, and so it's kind of a negative definition of freedom. And he's not doing a negative theology, or he's not doing a positive theology. So he's not like doing some kind of sort of mystical intuitionism, or he's not doing a very traditional theological explanation of freedom, because like, theological freedom is the absolute, yeah. So theological freedom is the ultimate form of freedom, isn't it? The sort of the monarchical freedom that is God, that which is utterly unbounded and has no impediments. That's the Whereas Heidegger is sort of saying that freedom is a very, very ambiguous, very mixed up, very contingent relationship between this impulse to become the God, and all the impediments, that humans are exposed to, which is quite comic if you think about it. We're gods that just trip up all the time.
Yeah, in a sense, it's a very limited type of God. So
Which is not a god at all.
Yeah. So
or a Christian god, I guess, or the theological
yeah,
god.
it's just it's a recognition that you don't have to be a god to create meaning, I guess. So it does come up quite abstract. That's I think something quite common in Heidegger's writing in that it's very easy to read it and not realize he's a phenomenologist. Because usually phenomenology, when you read it, is say something like Husserl. It's so detailed, and okay, there's like abstract arguments, but like I go to phenomenology conferences a lot. It's always very, and then like people feel this, people articulate that. It's all very, 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 very concrete. Whereas what Heidegger does is give us this almost abstract projection and theory that he's talking about. That's all grounded in experience, but you kind of have to do the analysis yourself. You kind of have to apply it to your own experience for it to become concrete. So, it took me a long time thinking about free. I mean, I think it's an incredibly obscure idea in the text, freedom towards death, and frequently misinterpreted because of that. But over the well, it's over a decade now since I started on this project. I'm sort of like, oh, I kind of get this or that part of it. So I originally saw, when I was young, you sort of see towards death as something obscure, and you're sort of like, oh yeah, okay, it's just doing what you want, YOLO, as the kids say. But more
Go on, Matt. What does that mean?
You only live once.
Okay.
Yeah, YOLO. I mean, I say the kids say
We're
that's
all
like,
learning today.
yeah, that's like 8 years ago. But I don't know. It's but even that oh, you only live once, even though it articulates something like what Heidegger's saying on paper, is itself a form of conformism because it's just an excuse to do something, and it's a hashtag. So there is this real concern with conformism that he's got in trying to articulate it. Not saying that being a part of a society is a bad thing. He's not saying go off. I mean, he frequently has said you can't just go off and be a hermit somewhere. That is not the solution. He's just trying to articulate this dynamic we have as beings between doing things in the way that society encourages to do them, and then sometimes doing something that's a bit more original to ourselves, something that's more of our own or authentic. And that's his idea of authentic. And it's just like, for example,
That belongs to us, yeah.
yeah, something that belongs to us. Whereas the way that authentic is used quite a lot is in incredibly inauthentic ways. Like LinkedIn profiles are constantly trying to, what people post on there is always like this performance of authenticity, but authenticity is not a performance. It's the opposite of a performance. It's just you. And so yeah, it's sort of, it can be really hard to sort of think your way into it because the entire language that he's dealing with, and I mean, it's not just coming from him, that those discussions of authenticity, it's in the air, but it's just being co-opted by things which are the exact opposite of what he's trying to talk about. So it's a very methodologically difficult philosophical argument to get into because you kind of have to relearn what a lot of words mean.
Well, so even the terms authenticity and inauthenticity, they're German translations. What is it? Eglinkeit, is that right?
Eigentlichkeit, yeah.
I think it's like, yeah. What he calls the day self, the idle talk, idle chatter, that's distraction. That's a form of allowing ourselves to be publicly interpreted, which is not necessarily, it's just one thing that we do with our freedom, I think, isn't it? It's just another thing that we allow happen to ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, so it's it's allowing ourselves to be public interpreter, but it's also interpreting ourselves as essentially public. So it's when you are the they, which is the this anonymous everyone in his sort of picture of unfreedom, we just we genuinely see ourselves in that way. I mean, it's close to what might be more familiar to people, Bad Faith and Sartre, but quite different as well. So Sartre gives that example of the waiter sort of adopts a performance of a waiter that's clearly inauthentic in one sense. Sartre just doesn't think you can ever be authentic.
Yeah. So the waiter is performing himself according to the essence of a defined role.
Yeah, and there are many ways that Heidegger talks about that still happens, sort of reading newspapers, being on public transport, going around. It's interesting you get this because Heidegger's philosophy of technology comes a lot later, but you get a little glimpse of it in Being and Time when he talks about this because it's all about media and reading and how we absorb culture. I mean, we could add today things like doom scrolling and use of social media and so forth. Different types of public performance in that way. And it's sort of when you fill out this description of how Heidegger thinks we are 99% of the time, and he's not saying it's a bad thing. It sometimes sounds like it. It's just saying this is what we're like most of the time. It is a story of mimicry. Humans see, human do. We just act like everyone else acts. And authenticity and freedom are the moments in which we do something that comes genuinely from ourselves, that doesn't come from how we've been brought up to act in a certain way. Doesn't is not how we're not doing something just because that's what they do. But it's like what Kierkegaard calls a subjective truth as opposed to objective truth, which is the difference between the Christian who goes to church every week, but objectively, but subjectively, they're not Christian at all. They don't have the ideals. They don't have that
Yeah,
leap
good
of faith.
example. Yeah.
Yeah. So Heidegger's basically just fully adopted that. So it's not what you do, it's how you do it and why. So that back to my example of the two reasons you could decide I'm just going to go off and travel the world. One could be because your older brother did it and they said it was good, or because you want to I don't know, because you've seen like images on Instagram and you want to be like the people in the images. You're just sort of like basically copying, as opposed to something more fundamental. But the more that you sort of try and point to it, it is, as I think you're right to say, really ambiguous and hard to pass. I mean, I'm not totally convinced myself that it's something that can always happen. That can happen. Yeah, I'm not. Sartre's really clear that he doesn't think that this is possible at all. And I think there are a lot of you can apply a kind of political analysis to it. It's a very I don't know exactly what ideology I'd pin to it, but it's certainly there's a bit tinge of liberalism there, that there's like this essential genius self that everyone has that gets crushed by. I mean, it starts to become very biographical almost. As a what we probably call a mid-career researcher when he's talking about it. He's had to having to publish his incomplete book so that he can get a job when he's been a permanent contract when he's been working for a decade there, and um, and
Sounds biographical, Matt. Does it?
but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's very relatable, I'd say, about Heidegger's experience, apart from the fact that he was a philosophical genius and I'm not. Um,
Oh, don't be so hard on yourself.
yeah, but yeah, so it's a bit like when I've been reading Hegel recently, the philosophy of right, and there's a bit where he just totally gets alienation, and I find it hard to even distinguish between what he says about alienation and what how I understand it in Marx. But his example is about his book publisher. It's just so personal. And so you could read this kind of biographical psychological reading of it. This is Heidegger's essential frustration with his position just before middle age and not really feeling that he's able to shine. And so I think there are reasons, I think, to sort of go, well, maybe this isn't the best way of interpreting these kind of like authentic actions. But I don't know. I guess that's the thing I'm undecided about, whether I actually believe it. But I'm not. I'm not in a position. I mean, I think it helps in a lot of situations. It's sort of, and I think it helps me understand things. But as you articulate, it's just sort of like, can we really do this? Can we really escape history, or is that really what he means? I think that it's still quite ambiguous there,
Well,
because it can't. Sorry, Patrick. I'll just finish this thought. It's on the one hand, you can never escape history, and whatever authenticity is for Heidegger's got to involve a relationship with history. But if it doesn't involve some sort of creative break, then I'm not sure what he means by freedom towards death in the authentic sense, and that it has to come from you, and not in a Nietzschean eternal return sense where it's sort of an acknowledgement of just doing this and so forth. There has to be something quintessentially you about the act in order for it to qualify. So
but what is quintessentially you is fundamentally contested. That's the whole
yeah,
point. That's and it's keeping that contingency palpable, isn't it? Keeping it as a form of possibility. That's what's important to Heidegger, I
yeah,
think. You mentioned the word "shine" there as well, isn't it? That's what people say. Well, freedom is in Heidegger, it seems to me, and this is what you're trying to grapple with, I think, and you kind of leave Heidegger behind as well. But freedom is has to be this is why we're beyond cause and effect. But freedom has to be connected to the activity of making one's life whole.
Yeah.
You say shine, which is another way of putting it, but being fulfilled, or where it actually where it comes to an end. But that's the fundamental paradox, because there is no end, because all ends are ultimately disrupted for Heidegger as well, other than the big one when you
Other
die.
than the
Yeah,
big one, yeah. I mean, it definitely helps to talk about that question of like being a whole. Sort of counter refutation to what I was saying about Heidegger, that problem of like it needs to, there must be some sort of break from what you're where you're coming from that's genuinely you. Because I mean, of course, that's to again reintroduce cause and effect, to try and like think of Heidegger's concept through. There's a past, and then there's a you, and there's a hard break, which is obviously not what he wants us to think about it, and it is more about that sort of seeing, trying to see the human being in its totality, or sort of
sense of completeness, fulfillment, I guess.
completeness,
Yeah,
yeah. Which is the language he uses, and it has been it is language that turns up in lots of positive conceptions of freedom. So it's in Kant, it's in Bergson as well, as we're free when we're acting as the totality of ourselves, rather than acting outside of it or only partially, and so forth. And again, these are all spatial metaphors that are quite hard to parse when they're being used to make a very specific philosophical point. They're not very
right.
precise. But what he, for Heidegger anyway, that sort of Dasein, or human being as a totality, is the recognition of everything that's true about the human being philosophically, which is this entire book, basically. So when you recognize the human being as this finite, temporal, historical being, that for the most part falls into the they and conformism and so forth, but sometimes can recognize that that conforming, we're never compelled to conform philosophically. It's always some level of choice not to make a choice, is probably how we put it. But when you recognize that actually there is nothing that grounds our decisions and our interpretations, there's just this abyss, which is the Abgrund, the
Right.
in the German. So it's the opposite word, Grund and Abgrund, ground and abyss. There's just nothing between us. It is just us. That is grasping the human being as a whole, is that there is nothing else. There's just this. There is nothing more. And when you act out of that realization, rather than the sort of borrowed interpretations from the tradition and from others, then it's something like freedom. The recognition that we're all possibility and not actuality.
So one of the thinkers that you mentioned there, and thanks for the talk about possibility, Matt. That's interesting, because Heidegger is, if I remember my Heidegger, it's the ideas that what he calls Dasein, which is Heidegger's word for being human, or the human being, or being in the world, more accurately, I think is what it goes by. Is that the Dasein is not something that's ended. It can't be complete. It can't be whole. Yet it wants to be. Really, really wants to be all the time, and it's caught in that sort of that dynamic. And what we are then is, well, we're not pure possibility, but we're beings for which our possibilities are always of concern. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so that is the big shift from. So yeah, he is advocating for a big shift in terms of thinking of the human being in terms of possibility instead of actuality. So cause and effect again only work if you're thinking in terms of actuality. So what actually is complete, and obviously possibility and actuality are quite abstract. Well, they're specialist terms now, but the terms in Aristotle that they're translating are all to do with production and making things. So something that's possible is not complete yet. Something that's actual is now active, fully working, and so forth. It's like prototype versus actually fully formed thing. And while you can, yeah, I don't think Heidegger's anti-science in the sense we would mean it today. He's not going to die on a hill over whether relativity theory works, or whether it's possible to have success in science by using this sort of treating everything as an actual unit that can be calculated through cause and effect and so forth. But when you're talking about humans, it just doesn't work because we are possible. We're possibilities, essentially. We're always something more. And that sort of emphasis on death is not here, it's always on the way. Death is the own-most possibility, the most authentic possibility that any of us have.
That's the toll, isn't it? That's the
Yeah,
totality.
yeah,
You're the sum total of appearances from birth to death is your whole,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. Basically, and that's always impending, imminent, on the way, but not here now. So as long as death is not now, I'm still active as possibility. So it's the constant recognition that this is not done, I guess. It's sort of the other way of looking at it. Rather than it's going to end, it's I've got this concrete time between now and when it's over.
Okay, so I want to sort of slightly shift tack at the moment, and one of the thinkers that's important to you, also for our understanding of freedom, is Kant. And Kant is a thinker who gives us to my mind at least, a very complicated picture of what being free means. And by that I mean we have the Kant of the first critique, who gives us an understanding of conscious free being and the limitations and the constraints of that, and how that makes our subjectivity possible. And there's the Kant of the moral, the critique of practical reason, his moral work, where freedom is absolutely essential to being able to be moral at all. It's the possible. It's what grounds the moral law, the categorical imperative, and things like that. Now, in the first critique, as I understand it, at least, it's a very technical, difficult book, and the links between the first critique and the second critique are very, very complex. But in the first critique, there is a sense that freedom is that the human being is sort of spontaneous, so that our subjectivity is continually generated, right, without any sort of being determined. And it doesn't really matter if we're determined. That's not what's important. I can see why the link to Heidegger. That's not what's important, because we have a self-understanding ourselves as free beings. So it doesn't matter. I mean, I suppose the hardcore determinists would say that's sidestepping the issue because you're still determined. But our self-understanding of ourselves is inherently free. Now, how is that? I mean, we could talk about the critique of practical reason, his moral philosophy as well. The idea that we're sort of to be free is to be a self-legislating being, autonomous being. But in that sort of the first sense of the first critique, what are you taking from Kant, or why do you think he's important for your understanding of what freedom is?
So Kant, basically, Kant sort of is where the contemporary problem of freedom begins, I think. So, well, in its current form, it kind of, not necessarily what he says, but how he's been interpreted sort of sets up those different positions that we were talking about before, like compatibilism, libertarianism. And it's because Kant tries to do both, because he's a determinist and he's a libertarian. So he wants to say that, yes, there is some sort of causal determination in time. Freedom is totally compatible with it, but because it happens in another world, i.e., in the now that what that other world is really contested with Kantians. But once you get into the second critique and the groundwork, which is the moral philosophy, that other world is the mind. So it's
Right.
it's rational. It's our own self determination and so forth. Now, I think he gets misinterpreted a lot, but basically, he sets up. He sort of becomes the foil in how the different positions get set up since him, which makes him a very important figure. I mean, the main boring reason why I ended up looking at Kant is that he's the one that Heidegger talks about. So Heidegger doesn't really go into any detail about anyone else. Oh, he does look at the German idealists a bit, but his main and Schelling. He writes a shorter lecture course on Schelling, but Kant's the one where he really goes into detail to distinguish himself from the tradition. So that's the boring reason. But it's really interesting because the thing with that first critique, which is a very technical book, it is about trying to solve metaphysics in a short. And the solution to metaphysics is that we've been asking the wrong questions, something that resonates with what I was saying about Heidegger earlier on. But more strictly, that metaphysics goes wrong when it tries to apply essential concepts that only apply to our experience and tries to apply them to things that are essentially beyond it. So to God, to the existence of the world, and to the immortality of the soul. The three groups that he puts into it.
There are things
And
of which we cannot know things.
yes, we can think about them. We can. Arendt calls this the beginning of the distinction between knowledge and faith. But sort of faith is something independent from just not knowing something. It is a fundamental faith of this cannot be known, but I believe it anyway. So Kant says you can believe in God if you want to, but philosophy is never going to help you try and prove that he exists. Now, the interesting thing with the problem of freedom is those three questions: the immortality of the soul, or the soul. So that's human. Then you've got the world, the cosmology, and then you've got God. And the place where freedom goes is the world, which is interesting because you would have thought it would be attached to the soul. I think if most people have got them to guess, they'd probably say it would be in that section on psychology. But that's already a clue that the way that Kant's talking about freedom in the first critique isn't really about human beings at all. What he's trying to do is separate out what has become now the modern sort of separation between the question of the freedom of the will in terms of metaphysics and things like social and political freedom and so forth. But they're still very much joined together. But in the first critique, he's not talking about humans at all. He's talking about the causal chain, basically, of all of reality. The Big Bang, effectively, is the context in which he's discussing this. Can there be one event which is the first cause for everything else? And he says that no and no. No and yes. So it says it's totally rational to say there is a first cause, and then he says it's totally rational to say there isn't. That it's an antinomy. Yeah. So something's gone wrong, and what's gone wrong is how do I do this without doing an entire 20 minutes on Kant's metaphysics? What's gone wrong is that cause and effect apply to our experience, but not to metaphysical reality, whatever that is. So cause and effect is something that the mind applies, like space and time for Kant, to how we experience the world and how we get knowledge of it. It's sort of a filter that sense data goes through and forms our rich experience that we actually have in the world, and where we don't just see sense data, we see objects, microphone, laptop, and so forth, and they can interact. And causality is an important way in which, though our minds represent the external world to us, but it's not part of it. It's sort of like a secondary quality in the earlier modern terms. And what happens is we go, right, I want to know whether there's a beginning in time of the universe, and we can't experience that. So it's basically like there could be, but you could never experience it. You could never actually fit it into something that a human could comprehend through knowledge and sensation and appearances and everything that's empirical. You can sort of postulate it, but that doesn't work because you're taking these. Because you're taking these very almost practical focus concepts on how we perceive the world and trying to apply them to imaginary speculative circumstances. And he argues that creates the antinomy because we're treating whatever the external reality is as determined by the rules that determine our little cut of it that we actually experience. So that causes the antinomy. His solution is to say that there's no reason there can't be two types of causality. And there's no reason why one event can't be caused by two things at the same time. And so he says that there's the story of natural causality, which is the one we're more familiar with through science and what we see through experience, which is every effect has a cause, everything bumps into each other and so forth, all mechanical. And then there is rational, there's potentially another causality, which eventually completely means something like rational causality, which the mind can grasp and think about and recognize, but that is not part of the causal chain in the world. And that's where he starts to articulate something that starts to look like human freedom. But the way that his example he gives is the imperative. And it's not any specific imperative. Obviously, got a very famous imperative, the categorical imperative. But he just means, he just says, look, as soon as you think of the concept of ought, or something ought to be otherwise, you are looking at a type of causality which is not natural, which does not go through It's not something science can talk about. It's not something mechanics can capture. But there's a recognition in reason that there is another type of compelling principle of what the world should be like, and it's sort of like, okay, you can, how I get to your house to visit you might involve an internal combustion engine with all sorts of physics. That can be the natural cause, but the rational cause would be, oh, I should see Patrick. I've not seen him in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And he says those are totally consistent. You can have both. And then I think a lot of the tradition synthesis says, no, you can't. That makes no sense. But I think that sort of that's not grasping the fundamental claim that he's making, which I think is quite interesting.
So, what always interested me about Kant, I can't remember the exact place. It might be in that famous "What is Enlightenment" essay.
Yeah.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but let me just try to sort of condense what you said there, because it's quite technical, and it's just like Kant is technical. But the idea
Yeah.
is that as we understand ourselves, in terms of how we experience the world, in terms of how the world appears to us, he's got this distinction between the nominal realm and the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realms. The world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself. The thing in itself is famous things. But irrespective of that, I think is what you're saying, is that so he's not denying the world of cause and effect, but irrespective of that, as practical agents, as we go about our business in the world, we are always free, right? And in some sense, so what I'm saying about is he's not trying to prove objectively or empirically that we're free, which is what the whole sort of free will and determinism debate always tries to do in philosophy. But he's not trying to prove from an objective, a God's eye view, or a third person standpoint that we have a free will. Instead, Kant is trying to explain to us, or to show us, that we have no other choice but to understand ourselves as free. It's nothing to do with choice. There's nothing we can do but understand ourselves from a first person standpoint, right? And that doesn't mean he's saying all freedom is subjective. It's just saying that that is the conditions of our understanding, which is a different thing, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So so it's we are. So I mean, there's the two different ways of those two. I think it is important to bring in the two different categories or concepts of freedom that he's talking about. So there's the transcendental freedom, which is what we were just talking about in terms of like a break in the causal chain and the antinomy and so forth. And then there's practical freedom.
Yeah.
So practical freedom which is what you were talking about, that kind of, it's like this sort of us as moral agents. They're linked. So we, in terms of the transcendental question, can there ever be a free cause? Yes, and it's us. So that's the end of that conversation. Then it's sort of like, well, what does that mean? You get the practical conversation, which is about the difference between negative and positive freedom. So we can so those are often misattributed to Isaiah Berlin. It is actually Kant, I believe, who came up with this distinction.
Right.
Which Berlin wasn't pretending. He knew that. He said it. It's just something that the textbooks don't always pick up on. But negative freedom is usually ascribed to Hobbes. There's nothing stopping me from doing what I want. No barrier, no imprisonment, no compulsion. Positive freedom is the more sort of social liberal idea that through an education, through certain types of character or character building, I am empowered to be able to make good choices. And for Kant, we're going to always be negatively free. There is nothing stopping us, which basically means we're always to blame for the things that we do wrong, because this is a moral philosophy now. And positive freedom is only when we act according to the moral law, which is the thing that always confuses everyone when you first read it, because Kant's picture of true freedom is obedience. And that's weird.
Right. So yeah, let's try and figure out that one, because that's a really common move. I mean, it predates Kant as well. I mean, it's the origin of that is in Rousseau, I think, in the where Rousseau puts together freedom and necessity, which is an idea that's taken up again and again in German idealism, especially in Schelling and Hegel, and also Kant. That's really contrary to how we understand it in terms of, I think, in an everyday understanding of freedom, and also the sort of a philosophical sense, right? So, like the idea that freedom is connected to necessity, right? I mean, you mentioned Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin thinks that, like, Rousseau takes that down some very, very scary political routes. Okay, but just and we can talk about that, and I'll get to the sort of the political questions as well. But now, when I'm talking about the nature of freedom, freedom is connected to necessity. What exactly does that mean? And the idea is being free is not a matter of caprice, and it's not a matter of being unconstrained, right? It's not a matter of impediments, but of being confronted with a question. So it's more Heideggerian language, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's being confronted with the question of what you ought to do with your life, and what norms you ought to take up, what roles you ought to choose, and what you ought or not believe.
Yeah. So it's sort of why does freedom get connected with necessity? I guess because true freedom, is freedom from caprice.
Oh, nicely put, Matt.
Yeah, it's the monk's freedom. It's the not having to worry about what clothes you're going to wear because you're always going to wear the habit. So it's not worrying about what you're going to do today because that's already been decided for you. So, I mean, this it's not to say this isn't controversial. But that's the line they're on. I do think Kant's. I don't think he explicitly puts it against necessity in a sense, but the role that necessity plays, or rather fails to play in Kant, is this continual assertion that basically as soon as you perform this calculus of working out the categorical imperative, this is how you're supposed to act. Rational agents are supposed to just get it and then always act like that, but they don't. And the sort of the tragedy of Kant's moral philosophy is him trying to find ways to sort of patch it to make that work, and it never does. He even tries, despite having in the first critique got rid of all of the arguments of this existence of God, he comes up with a new one to try and get people to start obeying the moral law, but it doesn't work. The system doesn't work. But there is this assumption within it that it will, because the necessity involved is reason or rationality. And Kant understands reason and rationality in universalist terms. So to be a rational agent it's already not even really a human being. You could be an angel even, but a finite cognizer, a finite rational agent is always going to add the sides of a triangle the same way, and this is the attempted claim, always come to moral conclusions in the same way. So if you come up with the wrong answer, it is okay for me to lie in this situation because da 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 da. You come up with the wrong answer, you fail to be rational. You've fallen down into something else, and that something else is emotions, desires, distractions, material necessities, and so forth. And so he defines positive freedom versus positive unfreedom as autonomy, the freedom one, and heteronomy as the unfree one. So heteronomy being governed by the law of other, the other here being not rational. So irrational motives, irrational emotions, irrational experiences, everything except the pure universal calculation that we're capable of. So to be free for Kant, you have to strip yourself of everything that the existentialists would see as human. You have to become this true, rational, moral agent. And when you do, you will always make the right decision because it will be, by definition, the rational decision. Because rationality for Kant isn't this, like it is, say, for early analytic philosophy, where it's adopting a set of methods and having an agreement over how to judge which conclusions are sound and so forth. It's sort of like this kind of like it's something that it's not something you do. It is a state in which you let your mind be itself as this like rational agent and don't let it be distracted. It's more Cartesian in that way because Descartes says that because his idea of his arguments for everything involve God never lying to you. He has to say that when we're wrong, it's because we choose to be wrong. Effectively, we assent to the wrong things by choice. There's something like that going on with Kant. Is that if you fail to be rational, that's because you've not allowed yourself into the proper default state of what a human being's supposed to be like through. Well, many reasons. One of them will be when he brings in history. You talked about his political essays, lack of enlightenment. So it's only when human beings get to a certain point of civilizational development that they're able to start doing this. And he thought we were on the cusp of which Europe would become this sort of bastion of of civilization and help bring, obviously that's where the colonial ideas have come in, help caretake the other cultures into that position as well eventually.
And help the yeah, so that's where he gets very quite chauvinistic and he's talking about the bringing the sort of immature, unenlightened folk into enlightenment. Yeah, nice one, Kant. Obviously, there's tons of critiques that has been made of Kant about whether he lives up to his own insights with colonialism and things like that. I've tried to get to what's constructive for you, I guess, in Kant's theory of freedom, and he's giving us this very interesting picture about ourselves as in some sense, it's a very provisional understanding of freedom because it's always something you have to do. You always have to act under the light of reason. You have to live up to the light of reason in how you ground your decisions. If you're not doing that, you're not truly free. But within that, then is the idea that in our self-conscious understanding of when we engage with the question of what we do with our freedom, that freedom is always inherent in everything we do. I think in Kant, it's always sort of generated. We're always grappling with it. We have better ways and worse ways of dealing with that. We could do it. We need to do it more rationally. But it's odd in Kant. It is a critique of practical reasons. It's a very concrete understanding. It's not. He's not saying that we like freedom is about retreating from the world. I think, which is often, I think at least, is mischaracterized as. It's not about retreating to a kind of a detached third eye, God's eye perspective, a third person perspective. I got those mixed up there. So we're not. Yeah. So it's not a question of. It's a question of imposing rational rules upon ourselves. So perhaps then, Matt, you could talk about some of those rational rules. I'm talking here about the categorical imperative, and I'm trying.
Yeah, I mean, it's so my way into this, in sort of really getting what he's at after here, is just to talk about that first formulation of the categorical imperative. So it's act according to that maxim, which at the same time you can will to be a universal law, which is obviously really technical, and it's not. I mean, you probably could put it onto a T-shirt, but I don't think it would be very popular.
Well, it's popular enough. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, plus something else for Kant. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, yeah, that is basically what he's saying. Well, but it can be hard to see how you get from that to the golden rule. I mean, the second formulation, treat human being, treat rational agents as ends in themselves, not means to an end. That one is sort of much more practical. Now, one of the ways that which it was certainly taught to me, and which I think is very common, is to say, well, what he's saying is, imagine a world in which everyone did that. Does it make sense? And if it makes sense, it passes. If it doesn't make sense, then you can't do it. And then you go into all of like the moral dilemmas, like what do you do if someone comes to your house and they want to kill someone in your house? Do you lie and say they're not there to save their life, which is the obvious, like what we'd expect a moral system to tell you to do, but Kant's like, no, you can never lie. But I think that way of looking at it is just a little bit. I mean, it's not wrong, but it misses the big personal challenge that's coming out of that statement. And the challenge is you should be consistent. Which goes right back to Plato. You should be rationally consistent. You can't believe two opposing things. If you do, you're in a state of a crisis of character. And so it's a challenge to say, you are a rational being. If you are making an exception for yourself, then you're no longer being rational because you're acting for yourself and not for the universe. You're not acting for everyone. And every truly moral act is an act for everyone of all times, and we might even add all possible worlds just for fun. So, I mean, the example I did an article for the conversation about this in the during lockdown because about the panic buying phase right at the beginning, and I just sort of found myself like there'd not been any bread for like 3 days, and then I got there and there was four loaves of bread, and I was like, well, I only need one, but
I could buy 4.
Yeah, I could buy 4 because of the. And that was a really good example because it was the people who were buying 4 that were causing the crisis because there was enough food. It's just that people were panic buying and they were buying too much, and that it's a violation of the categorical imperative. If everyone takes more than they need, then there will not be enough left over. So I think I did actually buy 2 anyway. and then I bought some. I bought like a bread mix pack for sourdough, like everyone else, like sourdough phase. But that I think that's a really good example of what he's trying to say. It's like you don't need to look at the consequences of the action to realize that you're acting unethically, because what you're doing there is putting you're taking more than you need. To take more than you need is to act irrationally, because you're effectively taking from someone else, and you don't need to look at poverty and hunger and the fact that some people were going without bread that week because of it, because of these actions. And so it's this challenge to be always rational, always to sort of lift yourself up from selfish motivations. And the other formulation we talked about, the treat everyone as an end in themselves, not as a means to end. On its own, it just sounds like the golden rule, which it
Mhm.
kind of is. But the force of it, if you attach it to that, the first version of it, only act, be rationally consistent, is just sort of saying, if you treat another human being as a means to an end is to treat yourself as a means to an end,
Mhm.
because you're not just denying them dignity, you're denying all rational agents dignity. And I think that, I mean, you said like there's a way in which he doesn't live up to his own standards. I think that's the clear one, because it just becomes so of its time, colonial, chauvinistic, as you said. But it's hard to, I don't know, I find Kant compelling. It doesn't work. And sometimes I read his political essays, and I'm just sort of like, if only, not the racist bits, obviously, but the bit where he's like, a theory for a universal history with cosmopolitan intent. He basically describes the EU at the end of that. And I was reading that sort of a couple of years after Brexit, and sort of seeing the line British politics has taken, and just sort of thinking, if only it was enough to just say that, just say, oh, it'd be nice, it was nice world state, everyone's happy, everyone's liberal, if only. Yeah, he doesn't live up to it, but I think it probably is a good thing to just sort of say, look, can we just take ourselves out of our own individual interests for a second and think as a collective? And he does define that collective as the whole of all
Humanity, yeah.
humanity, even if in his actual politics he takes people out of that category. If you read it according to the
Mm.
principle of charity, he's saying everyone should treat everyone with dignity, and I think that's all right.
That's a start, yeah. And it's quite. I suppose it's what's interesting to me about Kant is that it's a lot more provisional than it's given credit for, but it's also a lot more concrete. He's just talking about what it's like to be a human being when when you have moral questions, moral quandaries, which you impose upon yourself, or which are imposed upon you. Something might be nothing to do with you, and you can just buy the four slices of bread, four loaves of bread, and man cannot live without four slices of bread alone. But the thought is there that it's very kind of this is kind of phenomenological, and I guess that's why you see the overlap between Heidegger and Kant on the question of freedom, because it's human beings existing in a world, and it's nothing to do with an abstract principle. That's what I'm trying to drive at, Matt. It's not an abstract system. Moral systems have nothing to do with this. That's quite completely. You can't you can't be moral if you're subscribing to an external set of standards or an external set of moral prescriptions.
Yeah, and Heidegger sort of pushes it in this direction. Starts to make Kant sound like an existentialist, which he can't be, because it's all about the universal. He's an essentialist par excellence. But by pushing it in this sort of, no, this is a challenge. The imperative is a challenge to you in your humanity to be more human. He sort of takes it up, and that is where you get he turns it into his own version of authenticity, where rather than it sort of getting this sort of communal, everyone is the same if they're acting rationally. It's like, well, we're not all the same, but we're not all the same at all. We're all very different, but we all have the same basic condition, which is that there's no God to support us, no objective standards, no this is how to be a human being, and we're all thrown into an angst-ridden existence that we have to find our way through. And so, I mean, you can't get a moral ethics out of it. I think it's entirely incompatible to get a moral system out of that view, because there's nothing to attach it to. Kant's attaching it to the idea that we can perform rational conclusions in the same way. Heidegger's long past that. You can't do that. It doesn't work. People aren't rational. I mean, I think it's the thing that Kant himself, I think, started to realize throughout his work since making those claims is that no, it just doesn't work. People aren't rational, and you can't compel them to do things, to act according to a certain way. All you can, and how do you get this recognition? Well, okay, freedom is like what Kant says. It's a sort of state in which you're acting according to your innermost being. So for Kant, that's being a rational agent acting for the universal. For Heidegger, it's being a mortal agent acting in the face of their impending death and um, lack of ground. So there's a line coming out of Kant into Heidegger there. Obviously, it's a radical transformation as well. It's almost opposite conclusions as well.
Yeah. The, within the history of philosophy, the other strain of freedom or the addressing of freedom is in political theory, political philosophy, that we can't understand politics without understanding the question of freedom. In some sense, Plato's idea of politics is how do we construct the just society and the best society. That shifts in the modern period with people like Kant, and it's more a question of, or even in the sort of slightly modern period, people like Hobbes and things like that. Sarah Berlin, who you mentioned, he talks about this specifically. That gives us another understanding of what of how to understand freedom is, and the political question is always about where do you draw the line. So Hobbes draws the line between free, liberty and authoritarianism on the side of authoritarianism, that we need an authoritarian government to set the parameters about on these angry, brutish, and brutish and short-lived individuals, because you can't be leaving human beings up on their own. Like, they'll get up to all kinds of all stuff. Or if you think of someone like Locke, for example, Locke, he draws that line. Berlin says this specifically. Locke draws it more on the side of freedom, that humans should have more capacity, more opportunity to self-develop, and should have more freedom to pursue their projects and their happiness and their properties. And then I guess, and I mean, this is a very potted history, but I think Rousseau tries to sort of push those two things together in a very bizarre way. But that's I'm wondering then, with how we understand the question of freedom, is the political question, does that come out of the free will and determinism, or is there a different understanding for you? Because I take it you're not ending up in the same place as Heidegger is politically.
No, I'm not. I think, going through the Heidegger, I think that he's trying to push it back to something more Greek, which is what he does with most things. I think the political questions are also closer to Greek understanding of freedom. That it's freedom from compulsion, and freedom to live a good life. And I think there is a kind of dismantling of the metaphysical question in Heidegger, and then obviously you end up with this sort of question, and then you're left with the political questions, which he doesn't really articulate. And when he does articulate a version of it, obviously we know where that ends up. Which, I'd say, it's not the worst thing about what he did. It is a very dishonest reading of his own work, I would say. Looking at his work in the 1930s, it is not there. He claims it is, but it's not. I don't really see the link. He is really just trying to get in with the government, I think. Which is we can add that to his crimes. But to me, looking at the political areas of it, the lesson you get from it that is resonant with the political question is that humans are essentially volatile. They're not consistent, and so much of how politics operates, certainly today, is in trying to stop them being volatile, trying to make them act consistently. And if you look at just polling and psephology in general, it's all about trying to capture as close as possible a behavior of humans like their atoms, according to certain laws. And we know that works to an extent. Say the recent UK election, the MRP polling, which is sort of the best form of political polling we've got for general elections in the UK at the moment, was broadly on where we ended up. It was in the nuances that, but it predicted the correct government with the sort of right amount of majority. But if they'd done those polls like 3 years before, it would have told us we'd have a Tory majority now. Because people change what they think. People change what's important to them as well. And that's not to say that polling and psephologists aren't doing anything. I mean, they've got a really hard job because they've got to kind of crunch chaos into something that you can map out and predict statistically. But humans themselves do not, on an individual level, act in any sort of consistent way at all, which is why they have to abstract out in such large numbers to get anything like a fair prediction with all these like adjustments and so forth. So that, I think, is one way in which I sort of apply what Heidegger's doing to thinking about political situations, which is to always take assertions about the populace with a big pinch of salt, possibly an even pillar of salt when it comes to some people. Obviously, I'm quite concerned about where the polling is in this country at the moment because I don't want to reform government at all.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of really good reasons to believe that the polling does not represent what's going to happen in a few years. But really, we just don't know. We kind of have to. The interesting thing about democracy as a system is it hooks in all of the power of the state into that volatility. That there's always this risk of
it's like
anything could
sluice,
happen on
isn't it?
election. Yeah, I mean, it's like that thing Rousseau says: British people are free one day every 5 years, and then they hand over you use that freedom to hand it back over to the state. And that you there's always that risk something else could happen from what you expect.
Well, it's like I think going back to Plato here. Obviously, the psephology is what is it? It's measuring opinion at a particular time, and it's and it can do that. I think you're right. It can do that at particular moments. It can do that with some degree of accuracy. I know people say exit polls are more accurate than phone polls, or someone calling to your door or doing something online is different. But it doesn't. It's kind of a very it's a political technology, isn't it? That it's a way of understanding the present moment without understanding the duration of a set of political norms, obligations, and priorities.
Definitely. And then we can also sort of take that. So if you are someone who's immensely powerful and you want to control where power is going in a democracy, and you recognize that, so you've got this political technology which tells you where people are at the moment, and you want to shift it in a certain way. Now you have more levers than ever to try and do that. And Cambridge Analytica was years ago now, but the use of social media and so on, all of those technologies about that sort of fine-grained targeted control over certain types of people to get a tailored message to a certain type of people. It's what Heidegger was talking about with the they, and how we sort of take in our sort of cultural surroundings on a level that it's almost terrifying to try and contemplate it if you try and I can't. It's so big I can't even like think it. Yeah, it's just huge, because Heidegger's talking about, it's a bit odd that there's only like 6 newspapers. So that was his problem with it. Now it's like, well, you don't even know that you're looking at the same thumbnail on YouTube as everyone else who's looking at it. Everything is so bespoke to a kind of a guess about who you are as a person when you view things and consume things through these.
Yeah, so algorithmically driven. So we're back to algorithmically driven micro personalization.
Yeah, and for some people it won't work. Like I can't remember. I mean, maybe it would be too subliminal, but say moving away from the politics bits, sort of the more general money making out of it, which is a little bit more benign. But it's so rare that I ever click on an advert in Facebook or whatever. Like usually, what they shove on me is nothing to do with what I want at all. And, it's very rare that something like that will actually work on me.
Oh, Matt, the algos always know.
It depends. Yeah, basically, they're not as good as the people selling them have made out. But yeah,
they understand you as a demograph.
Yeah, so basically. So it's never going to go down to the individual, which is what they want. Basically, they want to be able to, they want a world in which I think this is Evgeny Morotov's article where you're singing a song as you in the shower, and then you pick up the shower gel, and on the back of it is an advert for that LP, or well, maybe not an LP, but that's the world that the advertisers. But yeah, so one assault on. Sorry. What I was sort of trying to build up to say is you've got all of these different technologies which are trying to use Heidegger's word, sort of enframe or beset us to line up in a predictable way are basically designed to sort of minimize or remove the volatility in human nature to make us as docile as possible. I mean, it's a kind of plenty of people have made that argument in general, but I think there's a particularly interesting way in which you can see it in Heidegger's vision of the human being, because although he's saying, yeah, we're this vibrant, dynamic, possibility, but we can pretend to just be a cog in a machine, and in fact, we do that most of the time. So you don't even get a firm fundament or in the theory. It's sort of like, yeah, humans can be free, but actually they can also not be. Based on the situation, and usually they really don't want to be, because being free riddles you with anxiety, because it fills you with responsibility for everything.
Yeah, true freedom. Yeah, there's a libertarian element to that as well. Like that, real freedom is not easy. I think that's you said it already, didn't you? Freedom is the freedom to free us from caprice, but freedom is not easy. Freedom is hard. It's difficult. It's a burden.
So it's sort of, humans are volatile. They don't want to be. They just want to get on with their lives and have a nice TV and be with their families and so forth. So I guess that a few different lenses, Heideggerian lenses on modern politics. One, humans. There's a lot of vested interest into making humans predictable, but they're not in nature. But they want to be, and they will let you. They will let you make you. Any excuse to stop thinking. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, I'm an elite person. I do it as well. Like, I just. I can't keep up with the news anymore. It's just everything is horrible every week. It's just like this noise and noise and noise. So I will take any excuse not to look into a particular story that slightly disturbs me. It's sort of like, I've got that ground news thing, but it just gets advertised a lot. It's sort of.
I'm not familiar. I'm old, Matt. I'm old.
You're not familiar. Okay, so yeah, it's good. They'll have to give you a sponsorship now. We mentioned it. It's sponsored by a lot of but basically the idea of it is it has a lot of information about who owns what particular publications. It uses some AI to categorize their political leanings and so forth and determine factuality. And so if I see a headline, so you'll see a headline on it, and if it's like something I don't like, and then underneath it says mixed factuality, I'll go, oh, I won't read that, then it's probably bollocks. It's an example of like where I will choose not to engage with something. And I just think that that's a perfectly natural thing to do when something is just so much of what matters politically today is well beyond the ability of even a state to resolve. 100 years ago, the big problems you would have concerned of would be to do with your wage, and you can sort it out with your trade union, which would have been strong and be able to negotiate. You can't. We're not in a position where but your power is so diluted because the problems are so big and require such international coordination. Like the government can't raise taxes beyond a certain point because people will just move country because no one else is taxing at that rate. That sort of thing. It's realizing that even the political structures of the world haven't got a ground to them and that you can take hold of is going to be deeply uncomfortable and unpleasant to sort of think about.
But also liberating.
Maybe.
Isn't that the point? Isn't that when the question of political emancipation becomes explicit? Or the ends towards which we might ask that question or think about means to which that can happen. And you don't have to be Karl Marx to say that folk have to have a sense of ownership, a sense of agency with regard to their political sphere. And isn't that? I mean, I'm improvising here and I'm speaking very quickly, but isn't that what's driving populism and all these things? Is that people feel disaffected? They feel that they don't have ownership or they're not connected to the political decisions that are being made.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But I mean, the trap in populism though is that, well, it's the implication that the people in power know what they're doing. I think this Zizek makes a joke about that. Like the problem with conspiracy theories is that they think that people know what the people in charge know what they're doing and actually have a plan. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's a trap in that, which is that,
It's a paranoid style of politics, paranoid great powers.
and it can kind of give you an illusion of feeling in control, to support the populism, but it's just another form of not really taking how complicated the world is, and how many possibilities there are. I guess, to put it back to that kind of Heideggerian way of looking at it, because it's so hard to look at the world like an existentialist. I mean, this is I think the central point of existentialists more generally is that no one really wants to be one, but once you kind of, it's this argument that once you're an atheist, as Sartre says, you've got to take it to its full conclusion. You have to go, okay, there is no plan. People are deeply volatile. My amount of control over things is quite limited, but then I have a sort of responsibility to act within that world anyway. And
one cannot but act.
Yeah, and so I would say one way of choosing not to act is to sort of say, oh well, this person will sort it out because they seem to have the right answers.
Yeah, so that's an abjuration of responsibility, isn't it? Because I'm putting it on the populist leader, or I'm putting it on the politician. It doesn't necessarily need even to be a populist politician.
It's a bit depressing, really, isn't it?
It is, Matt. Yeah, I thought you were coming on and I was going to be happy at the end of this.
No. Yeah. I never got the hang of Thursdays.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect place to end, actually. Yeah, freedom. If you think about freedom too much, it'll emancipate you, but you won't be chirpy. Thank you very much, Matt.